Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At the UFC Fight Night post-fight presser, Dana White was answering questions from MMA media members when he hinted at an announcement coming soon for the main event of recently announced UFC 293, September 10th in Sydney, Australia. And we're going to take a look at that clip in a minute because if you watch Dana White's post-fight, you may have completely missed it because it happened so fast. But it really got me thinking, what will be the main event of UFC 293? And the more I started to think about it, not only do I believe the main event of UFC 293 will be a mega fight, I believe when the announcement comes, it will blindside a lot of MMA fans. So what's going on right now, in case you've been living under a rock for the past week, the UFC signed a deal with the Australian government to bring a couple UFC pay-per-views there over the next couple years. What that means, the UFC has deals. They have one with Abu Dhabi, where essentially the government pays the UFC to bring their events to their country, to their state, to their region, and essentially they incentivize them by paying the UFC so they have an economic impact on the region. People flying there, people going to travel there to stay and go to the UFC fights. And essentially it helps the government make money. So the government is paying the UFC to come there and have a massive event. They have a deal in place with Abu Dhabi. Now they have a deal in place with Australia. So that brings up the topic of who is going to be in the main event of UFC 293. It's going to be September 10th of this year. And you start looking at the champions in the UFC right now. You have Brandon Moreno. He's not going to be the main event of any pay-per-view, most likely. And he's also fighting at UFC 290. You have Aljamain Sterling. He is fighting Sean O'Malley at UFC 292 as it stands right now. So he's out of the picture. Alexander Volkanovski's fighting in July at UFC 290. So most likely that's out of the picture. He would have been an easy target to main event UFC 293. Then you have Islam Makhachev. He's basically fighting in October at UFC 294 in Abu Dhabi. We already know that. We just don't know against who yet. You have Leon Edwards. Most likely Leon Edwards is not headlining event of UFC 293 in Australia. It's not going to happen. Then you have Israel Adesanya, which is the most logical choice, and he's available. Then you have Jamal Hill, who there's been speculation about him versus Yuri Prochazka at some point in August or September. We're going to talk about that in this video. And then you have John Jones, who the UFC's kind of already said that, look, John Jones is going to fight in November, December, somewhere around there. Is it going to be against Stipe? I don't know what's going on there, but it's almost definitely not going to be John Jones. And then you have the women's champions. You have Amanda Nunes, Weili Zhang, and Alexa Grasso. None of those are headlining events. So even if they were going to be on that card, which they're not going to be because Nunes is fighting in late June, so I doubt she has that quick turnaround and fights in September, but she could, but she's not going to be the main event. You have Weili Zhang. She's fighting in the co-main event of UFC 292 against Amanda Lemos, and we don't know when Grasso's fighting next, but she's not going to be the main event of UFC 293. I can guarantee you that right now. So basically, we have it narrowed down to Israel Adesanya. Well, who is Israel Adesanya going to fight next and defend his middleweight title against next? Well, that's not a very simple answer because if you look at the middleweight division, pretty much everyone's booked up. Alex Pereira is fighting at UFC 291 against Jan Blachowicz. So Alex Pereira is eliminated from the discussion. They've already kind of said, look, Alex Pereira is not fighting for the title next. And then also that kind of eliminates Jan Blachowicz because Jan Blachowicz was saying, I'll come down to middleweight. You can try to avenge your loss at middleweight. And that was kind of, intriguing to fans and people were kind of talking about that. Well, that's not happening because Jan Blachowicz has a fight. So then you look at number 2, you have Robert Whittaker. And we're going to talk more about Robert Whittaker in a second. He has a fight against Dricus Du Plessi at UFC 290, July 8th. And supposedly that is the number 1 contender fight for Israel Adesanya. Whoever wins that fight is supposed to fight Israel Adesanya next. But I want to look at the rest of the division. You have Marvin Vettori at number 3. He has a fight scheduled against number 4 ranked Jared Cannonier. Plus, both of them have already fought Israel Adesanya fairly recently. So it's most likely not them. You have Paulo Costa, who just recently had an announcement. He's fighting Ikram Aliskerov in his next fight at UFC 291. Plus, Paulo Costa doesn't deserve a title shot right now. You have Dricus, who I already talked about with Whittaker, and we'll talk about that fight in a second. You have Sean Strickland, who has a fight in early July against Abus Magomedov. You have Derek Brunson, who's a dead body at this point, and he's retired or supposedly retired. You have Roman Dolidze coming off a loss. You have Jack Hermanson coming off a loss. Kelvin Gastelum's going down to 170. Nasser Dean has a fight coming up against Chris Curtis, and he's coming off a loss. Brendan Allen has a fight against Bruno Silva. Chris Curtis has a fight, and I think Andre Muniz has a fight as well. But you're getting outside the top 10 at that point. Nobody outside the top 10 is challenging Israel Adesanya for the belt next. That's just not happening. So basically, we have it narrowed down to Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessi. And that's kind of where we get to the clip of Dana White, because Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessi, when it was announced 3 weeks ago, for UFC 290, which takes place on July 8th, it was announced that the winner of that fight would be the #1 contender for Israel Adesanya. And it also came out that Israel Adesanya was asking the UFC not to make that fight, and that he wanted to fight Dricus Du Plessi. He wanted to defend his title against Dricus Du Plessi next, and that basically he wanted to fight in the summer. He wanted to fight July, August. He wanted to fight Dricus Du Plessi. The UFC said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to make Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessi, which a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads because Robert Whittaker's already fought Israel Adesanya twice, and he's lost both those fights, and one time he got stopped. So there's really not a whole lot of appetite for a trilogy there, and usually there's not, especially when a fighter has lost twice to the champion. But Dana White said, look, the winner of Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessi will be the #1 contender. Well, if they're fighting on July 8th, and then UFC 293 is September 10th, that's an 8-week turnaround, essentially, a 9-week turnaround, essentially. So how is the winner of Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessi, unless they come out completely unscathed, how are they going to have that quick a turnaround? And even if they do come out completely unscathed, they got to jump right back into training camp and prepare for Israel Adesanya and try to take his belt away at UFC 293. That sounds like a tough task. And that's what somebody asked Dana White at the UFC Fight Night post-fight presser. Let's take a look at that clip, and then we'll come back and react.
UFC 293 is in Sydney. I'm guessing you're hoping Israel Adesanya headlines that card, but with Robert and Dricus fighting 2 months prior at International Fight Week, it's going to be a quick turnaround for the winner of that fight. Are you kind of thinking about that, or?
We'll make that announcement soon.
So you have Dana White asked, look, you said Robert Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessis is for the #1 contender in the middleweight division, but that's a 2-month turnaround. Typically, training camps are 2 months. Who knows? There could be an injury. There could be a cut in the fight. You know, how are they going to have that quick of a turnaround? And Dana White, with a smirk, says, we'll announce something soon. And that really got me thinking. I'm like, wait a second. What is really going on here? Because I already started to think, well, this doesn't make sense if Dricus Du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker is supposed to be for the #1 contender fight. That's really short notice to turn around on September. And I already started thinking in my mind originally, before I even had this idea to make the video, well, I started thinking, well, I guess if Dricus Du Plessis or Robert Whittaker can't fight for the title, I guess maybe they'll give it to Sean Strickland versus Abus Magomedov, whoever wins that fight. But that fight's happened July 1st. So that's only like a week earlier. But I guess if one of those guys was ready to go, if one of those guys came out unscathed, at least in that scenario, they would have 4 separate guys. You know, as long as one of those guys wins and one of those guys come out without an injury, then they could fight for the title. But I find it hard to believe that they're going to do with this mega deal they signed with Australia, with the government of Australia, and they're supposed to have this big event at UFC 293. I find it hard to believe you're going to have Adesanya defend his belt against Sean Strickland or Abus Magomedov. I just don't think that's highly likely. And that's still short notice as well. You know, just as short notice as the Whittaker versus Dricus Du Plessis winner. So then I started to really think, well, who could it possibly be? And I basically came up with 3 options, and 2 of them are absolute mega fights. So the first option for UFC 293's main event will be Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Du Plessis. And I know you're probably thinking, well, you just said it's too quick of a turnaround. Also, Dricus Du Plessis, highly unlikely to beat Robert Whittaker. Well, what I'm thinking the UFC could possibly do, and I don't think this is super likely. I just don't think this is going to happen. But what the UFC could possibly do, they can pull Dricus from his fight with Robert Whittaker. They can cancel that fight off UFC 290. UFC 290 will be just fine. It is stacked. And you take Dricus, and then you put him in the main event of UFC 293. Israel Adesanya, essentially on home turf, because New Zealand's so close to Australia, essentially on home turf. gets to go out there and put on a showcase against Dricus Du Plessi. You know, they can have the build up to the fight where they're talking about who's more African and whatnot and all that dumb stuff that apparently people get excited over, that type of trash talk. And Dricus Du Plessis, say what you will about his skill set, at least he's on a winning streak. So I think the first option, I'm not saying the most likely option, but I'm saying the first thing that came to mind, I was like, okay, Adesanya wants to fight Dricus Du Plessis. He's made it very clear he wants to fight Dricus Du Plessis. Maybe the UFC, because they signed this deal with Australia now, and they're going back to Australia, maybe they'll announce the cancellation of Dricus Du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker, and they'll announce that we will have Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Du Plessis as the main event of UFC 293. I do not believe that happens. I don't believe they're going to cancel that fight, and I don't believe they're moving Dricus Du Plessis to UFC 293, even though it is possible and it does kind of make sense. I don't think that happens. So who else could Israel Adesanya fight on UFC 293? Well, that brings in the next potential matchup. That is Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. It's been speculated for a while that Khamzat Chimaev is moving up to middleweight. You know, he hasn't fought. There's no opponent on the horizon. There's no fight announcement. There was talk of him fighting Whittaker. There was talk of him fighting Paulo Costa. Both recently got fight announcement. Both recently got fights. So Khamzat's kind of left out in the cold because everyone else in the top 15 of middleweight's all booked up. So the UFC could potentially do Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev as the main event for UFC 293. This fight would be absolutely massive. This would be one of the biggest fights the UFC could do. And I know there's a lot of champions out there in the past. They say, oh, I'm not fighting this guy. I'm not fighting that guy. That is not who Israel Adesanya is. He was calling out Yoel Romero when Yoel Romero was coming off a loss because Paulo Costa was injured and couldn't fight. He wanted to fight a freak of nature in Yoel Romero. And also, Israel Adesanya is very highly in tune to what's going on online and the narrative. And people think Khamzat Chimaev is the guy to beat Israel Adesanya. And Israel Adesanya, just his personality type is, okay, that's the challenge I want. I want to take on Khamzat Chimaev. The fans believe that's the guy to beat me. I want to take him on. And that would be a highly compelling matchup. And I think there is a very good chance that we could see Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. But the only real wrench in that plan is, first off, Dana White has said multiple times, and this doesn't mean a whole lot, but Dana White has said multiple times, Khamzat needs to fight someone at middleweight before he gets a title fight. Because he hasn't beat anyone ranked at middleweight. He hasn't fought at middleweight in a bit. And then also in his last fight, he was supposed to fight Nate Diaz and slaughter Nate Diaz as a favor to the UFC. And he missed weight and ruined the entire card. They had to shuffle everything around. It cost them a lot of money. And I don't believe they're happy with Khamzat Chimaev. The other thing that we have a problem with is Khamzat Chimaev is friends with the Chechen warlord, hangs out with him, trains with his sons. And it is believed right now, there's no hardcore evidence, concrete evidence right now, but it is believed that Khamzat Chimaev's travel is restricted. He's having a hard time getting into the United States. That's why he hasn't gotten a fight yet. And it's going to be equally as hard to get into the country of Australia. So that kind of throws a wrench in the plan. Is the UFC, because they have this deal with the government, are they able to work around that and get Khamzat Chimaev in the country for a UFC 293 main event? I think that kind of throws a wrench in the plans. And I have a feeling that Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev isn't happening. I think it's very possible. And that's why I kind of mention it second, because I'm going to get to what I think is actually going to happen in a minute. But I just think because of the travel restrictions, because of the fact he hasn't fought at middleweight, and because of the fact the other matchup I'm going to mention, I think just makes far more sense. I don't think that happens, but it is very possible, and that's why I wanted to include it in the video. So what do I believe is going to happen at UFC 293? I believe the main event of UFC 293 will be Israel Adesanya versus Jamal Hill for the light heavyweight title. The more I started to think about it, the more it made perfect sense. There was a rumor that Yuri Prochazka was going to return in August to fight Jamal Hill for the title. And Yuri came out and said that's way too soon. So that was like August 19th for UFC 292, I believe is the date. So if he's not ready for that, and he said I'm not going to be ready for that, he's not going to be ready 2-3 weeks later for September 10th. Well, if it's not Yuri Prochazka, then who is Jamal Hill going to fight next? And now maybe that gets pushed down the line, and maybe he fights him in November, maybe he fights him in December. But we're trying to find an opponent for Israel Adesanya. And when Yuri originally relinquished the belt there was talk, Dana White, the doctors were saying Yuri Prochazka is going to be out for at least a year. So that leaves him out till at least December, January at the earliest, according to the earlier prognosis. So I just feel like Jamal Hill's not fighting Yuri Prochazka. Do I think the UFC is going to book Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev? That's possible, but I don't think it's super likely. And you add to the fact that they signed this deal with the Australian government, this massive deal. They're getting paid to go to Australia and hold this event. They're going to put Israel Adesanya as the headliner. And usually when they sign these types of deals, they like to go in with a massive fight card. And Israel Adesanya versus Jamal Hill would be massive. And we know Israel Adesanya has 2 title holder aspirations. He went up and fought Jan Blachowicz. He lost. He said, I will do it again one day. I will go up and try to capture that second belt. And I believe right now he has no contenders. Alex Pereira is moving up as well, which we're going to talk about in a second. And I believe Jamal Hill, outside of Magomed Ankalaev, there's really no one else for him to fight right now unless they book him with Johnny Walker or a rematch. That ain't going to happen. So who are they going to book him against if Yuri's going to be out? Magomed Ankalaev isn't highly likely, but it's possible. It's the fight that makes the most sense based on who's currently at light heavyweight. I believe they're going to book Israel Adesanya versus Jamal Hill. Israel wants to be double champion. Jamal Hill doesn't have an opponent. It's not going to hold up either division. And also, if they do Dricus Du Plessi versus Robert Whittaker, that can still be the number 1 contender. Even if Adesanya wins the light heavyweight belt and doesn't come back down, or if he loses and he comes back down, Dricus or Robert Whittaker still can fight Adesanya in the future or fight another contender for a vacant belt if Adesanya goes up to light heavyweight and doesn't come back down. I just think everything's fallen into place. And then I started thinking, what happened at UFC 284? Alexander Volkanovski went to become double champion against Islam Makhachev, and where did they book that? They booked that fight in Australia. Israel Adesanya, it's kind of his home turf. I think they're going to book him against Jamal Hill, attempt to win the light heavyweight title and become double champ in a mega fight at UFC 293, because that's the only thing that really makes sense. You know, I broke down the other fights. There's a chance it's Khamzat Chimaev. I truly believe if you had to nail me down for a prediction right now, it's Jamal Hill. I think it could be Khamzat Chimaev. I think it could be Dricus Du Plessis. I think Khamzat Chimaev's far more likely than Dricus' fight with Robert Whittaker being canceled. But I think it's going to be Israel Adesanya versus Jamal Hill. He's going to attempt to become double champion against Jamal Hill. And imagine if he wins. Imagine if he wins. Israel Adesanya versus Yuri Prochazka for the light heavyweight title. That would be incredible. And then imagine, in the meantime, at UFC 291, you have Alex Pereira versus Jan Blachowicz. Imagine if Alex Pereira wins. Then you set up a fight in the future where you have Pereira as a number 1 contender potentially for the light heavyweight division that now Israel Adesanya is the champion of. Alex Pereira, there's all talk of Alex Pereira following Israel Adesanya around. That storyline, that backstory, to have that trilogy after UFC 287 where Adesanya flatline KO'd him, that would be incredible. And we're talking far into the future, but it kind of all makes sense. And the middleweight division isn't log jammed at all because Israel Adesanya's fought everyone already. So I really do believe that at UFC 293, we will get Israel Adesanya versus Jamal Hill for the light heavyweight title. And I think it's going to be a massive fight card. And I think that's an incredible main event. And I just think it just makes so much sense. And that's exactly why I'm making a video about it at 4 a.m. I'm going to release it later today. But as soon as I started to come up with this theory in my head, I was like, I have to make this video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Am I completely off base here? Is Israel just going to wait for the winner of Dricus versus Whittaker? Is it going to be a completely different main event and Adesanya is not going to headline UFC 293? Because I really don't see that either. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.